We are in your world history book, and we're in chapter 13, section 3, and talking of feudal France to national status, which is the French monarchy. We just finished section 2, which was on the kings of English, or the English monarchy. Now we're going to go see what's happening in France at this same time. So we have here, this is a castle in Avignon. So we have to go back to the Treaty of Verdun. But prior to the Treaty of Verdun, we basically had, Charles Martel and Pepin, and from Pepin to Charlemagne. So now we have the great Charlemagne's empire, which he was this great Roman empire, and he had basically took over all of Europe, the Franks, the kingdom of the Franks, right, at this time. And they were in line with the Roman Catholic Church, so at this time. In fact, they had become Christians and been baptized in under Catholicism, right, in the midst of all this. And I'd say Christianity did reign to some extent in Charlemagne's empire. But going on from this, after Charlemagne's time, we have the kingdom divided because of his heirs, his sons. They did not agree on everything. Of course, he had a multitude of children, Charlemagne did. But anyway, divided between these three basic kingdoms, the individual kingdoms of the Franks, which were Charles the Bald, Lothair, and Ludwig German. So we begin the German national foundation, and we begin French, the Franks, and on over here. So we have it all pretty much divided between these three. It ends up with two. But anyway, we'll go on in the midst of all this. And so they had the individual kingdoms of the Franks here, and under the Treaty of Verdun, treaty so that they would get along. So remember, Treaty of Verdun is a really old treaty. 843 was the year of the Treaty of Verdun. 900 French nobles, which had vast wealth and strong armies, were all around in the midst of these kingdoms. And the Carolingian, these Carolingian kings, Carolingian means Charles, these kings under Charlemagne were Carolingian kings. They were only active in wartime, so they weren't considered of utmost importance because there were so many French nobles, like 900 French nobles that had their own little kingdoms. So in 987, we have 843, and then into 987 was the last Carolingian king of the Franks, and controlling of totally of Europe, Europe at this time, besides Spain there. But so now we have a noble, and this noble takes over, because the Carolingian kings had become very weak. And this noble that was chose for king, his name was Hugh Capet. So now we're going to have what's called the Capetian monarchy. Capet meaning Hugh Capet's monarchy. The Capetian line of kings begins the modern French nation, because now as Hugh Capet, he's starts with this Paris and the Ile de France, and he's centered in Paris. Capet controlled this area only, but as this area was a very important area, metropolitan area and such, and King Capet controlling this, and this area surrounded, this was called the Ile de France. And every gain for a king was a loss for the nobles, because when a king would become king, the nobles wouldn't have so much power. The French monarchy, going from the Capetian dynasty, from Hugh Capet, we have Louis VI, and he reigned 1108 to 1137. And he strengthened the Ile de France in Paris, as did his father. And the kings at that point were domineering over those 900 nobles, remember? And he gained most of his land. Most of the land, he started gaining land by conquering the English. The English being basically run out. We'll see later on being totally run out during the time of the Hundred-Year War, or practically totally. They still controlled just a small amount. And also Louis the Sixth, he did crusades for the Pope. He was during the time of the Crusaders. Remember the French kings were very involved in the Crusades, much more than the other national areas of that time, because they weren't totally nations, but the French were very involved in the Crusades. So we have Philip Augustus, and we know that he was in basically during the Crusade of Kings. So, and Philip Augustus, too, he went with Richard Lionheart, being the son of Eleanor. Remember Eleanor of Aquitaine? And she was actually involved in the Crusades too, but the Crusade of Kings was with Philip Augustus of France, Philip II. Philip the First, as we go on, we'll know that, remember, Eleanor was married to the French king, which was Philip's father, and then she went on marrying an English king. Well, you went over that already. Anyway, we go on with Philip Augustus, and he was stronger than any other of the nobilities in France. He was Capetian too. And he was very much in the Crusades with Richard Lionheart, and he seized much of the French territory all the way from England. So France became bigger than it ever had been before. Not totally before, because under Charlemagne he controlled all of Europe. Anyway, he seized Normandy from King John back when. He seized Normandy, so now he controlled Normandy. France also made Paris the cultural center and government center and scholastic center under Philip II. And he appointed many new officials. He was a very strong king, Philip Augustus. Augustus means king of kings, Augustus Caesar was supposed to be the king of Caesars. So now he feels like he's the king of the French. Louis the Ninth was Philip's grandson, and he reigned between 1226 and 1270. He was the most memorable king of this period. He was called Louis the Pious. Like Louis the holiness or pious. He loved the Crusades, but he actually accomplished nothing in the Crusades. He improved French laws for the kingdom. He was the end of the reign of France, which was most powerful in Europe, and he had very much endowed with a country with French patriotism. The Capetians, we're still talking about the Capetians, Hugh Capet dynasty, and the Roman Church. So did they support the Roman Catholic Church? You've got to believe they did. Remember, Clovis did, Pepin did. Clovis, he basically saw, the same as Constantine, he saw the Lord in the midst of battle, and he went and became a Christian. Pepin went in and made sure he was baptized, and so has Charlemagne on Christmas Day. Remember those things? And these three were very influenced by the Pope at that time. Philip the Fourth, 1285 to 1314, he started quarreling with Pope Boniface. So Pope Boniface the Seventh or Eighth, Pope Boniface the Eighth. And Philip said, the king, we could tax those clergymen. The Pope is making a lot of money and doesn't have to pay taxes. And actually, not only the Pope, but the whole Catholic Church was taking in all the money, and they did not have to pay taxes to the government. And the King Philip said, yes, they do have to pay taxes. Oh dear, that's going to really make them mad, because they have not had to pay taxes before. So the clergy, he also believed the clergy could have trial in ordinary courts of law. Philip said, the Pope and these cardinals and such, they think they're above the law, but they're not. If they do something wrong, we can try them in ordinary courts of law. Oh dear, Pope and his and those that were priests in the cardinal in the high places did not like that. And then Philip Boniface rebelled and said no way that he was going to do these things. No way were they going to pay taxes. No way were they going to be tried in the courts of law. So Philip arrested Boniface, who was Pope. Ha! He arrested him. So we have a king arresting the Pope. This was a time that was called Babylonian captivity of papacy. Babylonian captivity means basically the Pope and the Catholic Church had got to go into hiding someplace else, right? But when you think of Babylonian captivity, you think the Babylonian captivity of Israel, when Israel was taken away captive into the land of Babylon. But here we have the Pope, the Catholic Church, being taken away to France from Italy to be captive in France. So the Pope, by the King of France, was arrested. They arrested the Pope Boniface. They arrested the Pope, and they call this the Babylonian captivity, or the Avignon. Here's the word Avignon, papacy. That is where that is where the Pope was taken in, and the popes were taken in, and they could live there, not in Italy, but they had to live in France. And this period was between 1309 to 1376. So we're talking almost 70 years. Hey, 70-year captivity, right? And during which 7 successive popes had to live in Avignon in France. So here we have a picture up here. We have Avignon, these popes, and then we have the popes in Rome, and they're fighting. So we're going to have some fights, aren't we? So the situation arose from the conflict between the papacy and the French crown. So basically the king and the pope did not agree. And Philip forced a deadlock conclave to elect French Clement V as pope. So King Philip said, I'm going to appoint my own pope. And so he finds a French priest, and he makes him pope in 1305. And then Clement refused to move to Rome because he thought, if he goes to Rome, he's going to be persecuted and maybe put to death. So he stays in Avignon. And in 1309, he moved his whole court, this papal court, his Pope enclave, into Avignon. And it remained 67 years, so almost 70-year captivity. The popes were so-called captive in Avignon, France. A total of 7 popes, I always think of sevens, resigned at Avignon, and they were all French. They all spoke French. They didn't speak Italian, and they were all under the influence of the French crown. The king controlled the popes then in Avignon. So think of this as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy at Avignon. Papal bulls. What are papal bulls? They're decrees. So basically, the papal bulls, those decrees of the Pope under Boniface basically said in 1296, the clergy, the popes, were not to pay any taxes to any rulers. Popes, they said, we're not paying any taxes. Enum Sanctum in 1302 said the Pope was the supreme authority, that the Pope has authority over the kings. So basically saying, we're deciding what you kings do. Well, that's when Philip got mad, and that's when he invaded Italy and tried to take over Boniface. And he took Boniface as a prisoner for ransom. And then Boniface died of humiliation. So we have this whole battle between the kings and the popes. Avignon. Let's go over this a little bit. What happened in Avignon? Here's a picture. I've been there and traveled in Avignon and all of this, and it's the castle is a very unique place. Indeed, as you travel through, like, oh my goodness, the popes were here? I never knew that. Avignon. In 1376, Gregory XI abandoned Avignon and moved his courts to Rome. So he arrived in January in 1377. So they're going back to where? To Rome, to the Vatican, which is in Rome. After Gregory's death in 1378, deteriorating relations between his successor, Urban the Sixth, and the faction of Cardinal gave rise to the Western Schism. This started a second line of Avignon popes, subsequently regarded as illegitimate. So what happened then is Gregory goes back to Rome, and then they have the schism. They're fighting, these popes are fighting, and then in France, these French popes go back to Avignon. So we have two places and two popes. One's in Avignon and one is in Rome. Two popes. Can you believe that? We have a time of two popes. The last Avignon pope, or anti-pope as they called him, was Benedict. Benedict the 13th lost most of his support in 1398, including that of France. So this anti-pope that lives in Avignon now was not even considered a pope. After 5 years of besieged by French, he fled to Pergamon in 1403. The schism ended in 1417 at the Council of Constance in France. So we have this, basically it's a fight among two popes. The Estates General was the French Parliament. So now we're coming out of the deal with the Pope, and we're going into France and how they were ruled. Well, remember, England set forth itself a parliament because of the nobles coming in, and so did France. But the church still maintained the social status in the parliament there. And the king of France picked the clergy, and the popes had to submit to the king, just like King Philip said, basically saying the French popes have to submit to him. But the parliament in itself was not as powerful as the English parliament in per se. The first estate, there was 3 estates. There was the Estates General, the first, second, and third estate. The first estate were the clergy. That means were those priests and such that up to the popes. They were the clergy. The second estate were the nobles, very wealthy, high people of noble status. And the third estate were just all of the commoners. So you can say we have the Estates General, the French Parliament, divided into 1, 2, 3 estates, clergy, nobles, and commoners. The results of the 100-Year War. We talked about this already. In 1328, the last Capetian king died. I think I'm going to stop here and go on to the next because I still have to go over some other things. So let's stop here and we'll start with the results of the 100-Year War in the next video.